if your neurodivergent child struggles to hold instructions in mind, struggles to remember their thread halfway through a sentence or organise their ideas, this is very often an issue of executive function. So it's not a lack of understanding or intelligence. Now, in the previous video, I was explaining how brain filtering and processing is quite different in neurodivergent brains because they take in so much more information from their environment, more sensory input, more detail, more internal thoughts to process. Now, executive function is the system that has to organise all of that information. And it's managed mainly in the prefrontal cortex part of the brain, what I refer to in coaching as the thinking or the wise owl part of the brain, depending on the age of the children. Now, executive function helps us plan, to organise, begin tasks, remember instructions, shift attention from one task to another, and to regulate our emotions. It allows us to take multiple pieces of information from that prefrontal cortex, arrange them, decide what's most important, prioritise them, organise them, sequence them, so that we can do whatever it is that we need to do. So when executive function is working really well, a child will be able to hear your instructions, to listen to those, hold them in mind, decide what they need to do first, and act on it. But when it's overloaded, the information cannot stay organised so efficiently. So the child might understand what's required, but the steps don't remain accessible to them for long enough to actually turn into an action. That's when you will see forgetfulness, hesitation, difficulty getting started. So all neurotypes do experience this. We all experience executive function strain to some extent or another, particularly when we are under stress. And when any of us are tired or overwhelmed or thinking about too many things at once, executive function is going to become less efficient. But this is exacerbated for the neurodivergent brain for different reasons, depending on your neurotype. So for ADHDers, for example, executive function is very closely related to dopamine levels. And dopamine plays a key role in motivation and activation in the prefrontal cortex. So because dopamine levels fluctuate, we think of dopamine levels as tidal. Sometimes they're very low, sometimes they can be very high, and you'll have hyperfocus. But because those dopamine levels fluctuate more, tasks have to be interesting or urgent in order to increase that level of activation in the prefrontal cortex. Equally, if tasks are not urgent or interesting, if they're a bit repetitive or low interest, then that level of activation, that dopamine, is going to be lower to support executive function. So an ADHD child can know exactly what's required, but they don't have the neurological activation to be able to act on it. Now, it's slightly different in autism, in autistic children. Their executive function is more impacted by sensory overload and emotional overload. So if a child is managing heightened emotions or sensory input, things are bothering them in a sensory point of view, a large amount of energy is going into managing that sensory regulation or that emotional regulation, which means that they're not able to think as clearly and exercise those executive function skills as efficiently, particularly when it comes to having the capacity then to organise or shift attention from one task to another or planning things. This is why processing scores in autistic children tend to be much lower. Again, it's slightly different again for dyslexic children because their executive function struggles are far more associated with working memory and the demands of language processing. So if they're reading or listening or processing instructions, that's going to require more mental effort for them because of the way their executive function is wired up. So any requirement to hold or organise information places additional load on their executive functioning skills. So whatever your neurotype, the reason behind the executive function Difficulty might come from a different place, but whatever neurotype you are, the point is that you are holding more information than you are able to work with, which is why organisation becomes so much of a struggle. So then the practical question is, what can we do to help? Well, I've got 3 key words for you to remember that will help with executive function. The first is to reduce the load. We need to externalize. We need to take what is being held in that prefrontal cortex out. We need to externalize it so that we can move information out of the brain into the environment around us. So that can be writing it down. It can be writing instructions down, using checklists, having visual prompts and reminders, breaking tasks into short, manageable chunks. Anything that takes it away from having to hold on to that information in mind. Because when the structure exists externally, the working memory is then freed up. The second thing that we need to do is regulate routinely, and this will help improve executive function skills. Because if we are able to reduce emotional or sensory overload, then we're freeing up space for them to be able to exercise those executive function skills like organising and remembering things. A regulated nervous system supports clearer thinking, and movement, predictability, connection, routines, all of these things help ensure a better regulated nervous system. And then the third thing to do is all about activation. And different neurotypes need different activation support. So for ADHD children, it might mean ensuring that there is plenty of novelty in an activity, plenty of opportunity for movement, giving them very tight time boundaries so that activation is supported. For autistic children, they need activation supporting differently because they just need more predictability and clearer expectations in order to support their ability to activate these executive function skills. And likewise with dyslexic children, it might mean that we need to chunk information for them, break it into smaller chunks so that their processing speed is increased by taking some of the pressure away. So if we understand executive function in this way, we're able to change how we respond when we are faced with executive function challenges like organisation, planning, forgetfulness. If we know the source of the issue for our neurodivergent children, then we can put structures in place externally to support those executive function skills. Now, if you've got neurodivergent children in your life, a great place to start is my specialist guide, Navigating Neurodivergence, the 3 Big Breakthroughs. That guide is short and to the point in giving those 3 big breakthroughs, but it will give much more information and practical examples in how to implement them. So follow along and I will see you at the next video.